Resident Evil is one of the most enduring series in modern gaming, a franchise that has experimented in a variety of genres and establishing tropes that come to define the industry over the past 25 years. But it is also a series that has survived through evolution and persistence, not just reinventing its own identity, but also revisiting games throughout the series to revitalise them for new audiences. As a franchise, Resident Evil has been horror, terror, action, and everything in between. But what makes each of these phases of the series so appealing? And how does it go about making these drastic transitions without the audience losing faith? I'm Tommy Thompson, and in the first of a series of Design Dive episodes, we're taking a look at the evolution of the Resident Evil franchise by examining the link between core gameplay mechanics and AI behaviours, how each entry of the series seeks to invigorate the franchise and take it in new directions, for either good or ill. From the very first visit to the Spencer Mansion, through the streets of Raccoon City, all the way to the castle of Lady Dimitrescu.
Resident Evil.
It's safe to say that fans of Resident Evil are not starved for content. The Resident Evil series has, at the time of writing, seen 28 games released over a period of 25 years. While many of these titles are spin-offs revisiting critical story moments or exploring gaps in the narrative between main entries, there are 13 primary games in the series that effectively represent 3 distinct modes in which Resident Evil has defined itself. First up is the survival horror phase, which begins in 1996 with the original Resident Evil and its director's cut in 1997, followed by 1998's Resident Evil 2 and 1999's Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, all released for the Sony PlayStation and then ported to other platforms. Plus Resident Evil Code Veronica, originally intended as the true Resident Evil 3 and an exclusive for the beloved Sega Dreamcast, released in the year 2000. And finally, the remake of Resident Evil and the prequel Resident Evil 0, originally exclusives for the Nintendo GameCube in 2002. These games are typified by the fixed camera perspective and the character-oriented control system, which has a huge impact on the way levels are designed, and the AI accommodates the technology and level design accordingly, and we'll be exploring that in this video. Secondly, there is the third-person action phase, brought on by the trilogy of 2005's Resident Evil 4 for the GameCube, followed by Resident Evil 5 and 6, released for PC, Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in 2009 and 2012 respectively. Resident Evil 4 is the start of a large transition in how encounters are designed in the franchise, typified by the village in the opening hour. This brings about a phase that becomes increasingly more focused on terror in the heat of combat than survival horror. While there are other third-person action games in the series, notably the Revelations sub-series, the other games of note are the more recent remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 for PC, PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One in 2019 and 2020. However, these are quite distinct from the rest of the third-person games, given they work largely to reintroduce the horror focus, and we'll be visiting these separately. Lastly, there is the modern series of first-person horror, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard and Resident Evil 8 Village, providing an even more intimate and terrifying take on the series by placing the player more directly into the horrors that await, be it in the Baker family residence of Louisiana or the infested villages of Eastern Europe. So let's get started by revisiting the original survival horror Resident Evil games. However, I'm going to omit looking at Resident Evil 2 and 3 in too much detail for now, given much of what we're about to cover applies to those games. I would still like to look at them more closely when we check out their remakes in a later video. The original Resident Evil games defined the template from which all subsequent games, not to mention many a competitor, would derive from. Originally pegged as a top-down 2D game for the Super Nintendo, followed by a transition to the Sony PlayStation, first building towards a first-person perspective before the third-person fixed camera perspective that the games became known for. Players explored the world from a series of fixed camera angles, achieved using pre-rendered backdrops, with 2D and 3D objects placed into the world to provide a sense of scale, depth, and realism. In fact, this approach is used for Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, the Remake, and 0, the one exception being Resident Evil Code Veronica, which uses fully rendered 3D environments allowing the camera to pivot and follow the player around. Despite this, the game still largely adheres to the fixed camera concept. Given these camera perspectives, the controls of the player character are then egocentric and relative to their current orientation, moving the character on their forward vector or rotating on the spot. These tank controls, as they're often called, make the game feel disorienting. This leads to the first of Resident Evil's most interesting and evolving design concepts, the player's connectivity and interaction with the game world. While you're in direct control of the character, you are visually and spatially detached from them, and this is a pretty important distinction which works on a number of levels. You are caught up in the horror as it is playing out, but your emotional connection with what is transpiring is not directly attached to yourself, given you're playing as Chris or Jill or any of the other series protagonists. This meshes well with the control scheme, given the orientation is sufficiently jarring and juxtaposed from your perspective watching this all play out on the screen. This means having to act to keep these characters alive can often be a bit of a scrambling mess, and mistakes frequently can happen. Fans of the franchise will of course know that this orientation is not retained, and the camera and controls align more gradually in later releases, but this is in turn a reflection of a change in direction and overall priority. Ultimately, character position and controller orientation is one of the key design elements of Resident Evil, and it's the easiest aspect of the franchise we can observe throughout the evolution of the series, but, as we'll discuss in a moment, it has a huge impact on the effectiveness of the enemy AI design and behaviour. The second critical design element of Resident Evil is players' understanding of the world and its overall connectivity. The original games are fundamentally comprised of a series of rooms. These rooms can be within the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil, the cabin cars of Resident Evil 0, or the prison in Code Veronica. These rooms can be indoors or outdoors, it doesn't really matter. They are fundamentally individual sequences of play viewed from one or more fixed camera angles. They are ultimately disparate segments that are loaded into the game when prompted. The transition from one room to another is reliant on short loading screens that show the slow opening of the door into the next room. While this is nothing more than a mechanism for loading in the next segment of play, an element that isn't even required all that much in modern hardware, the short delay before opening the door helps build the tension of the experience, especially as you move to enter a room you have never visited before. But once a room has been visited, it's expected you're going to remember its contents and its location within the context of the larger world. This is important for the earlier games, given the greater emphasis on non-linear puzzle solving. Many of the puzzles in the game are often not solved until hours after first passing them. While over time you will find new regions to explore, you will find yourself returning to areas you've previously visited, given you can now solve a puzzle or access a room you couldn't until now. This is typified by the original game, given you will visit the other buildings on the grounds of the mansion throughout the story, largely to discover keys or other elements that allow you to solve puzzles or open up entire sections of the mansion you couldn't before. This actually helps maintain the tension, given, as we'll see later, enemy encounters in rooms are prone to changing over time, and as a result it forces the player to keep their guard up. The third and last critical element is resource management. Resident Evil as a franchise is often built around a scarcity of resource, a limited amount of ammunition or health items. Even in the earlier games, the number of saves you could make was inhibited by the number of ribbons you could find for the typewriter. Even if you then find these resources, the player has a limited amount of inventory space within which to store it. While the storage lockers provide a mechanism to stockpile resource, and it teleports between lockers throughout the map, you still need to acquire the item and put it in the locker to begin with. This third element ties back to the previous one, given it's necessary to find resources and remember where they are. This can mean taking a detour throughout the map to find that one item you now really need, which can in turn mean revisiting rooms or corridors with enemies you've previously avoided. There is some frustration with this, given the idea of being able to safely drop items wasn't introduced until Resident Evil 0, but then the prequel suffers because the drop mechanic was introduced to offset the fact that the game does not provide storage lockers, forcing you to maintain a hub of unused items and a more convoluted inventory management process. Ultimately, turning your character into a pack mule is a double-edged sword. You may find yourself spending more time than necessary figuring out how to complete tasks without using any items, only to then reach the final boss with a surplus of bullets you just don't need. But on the other hand, you could overstretch a little and then reach a mid-game boss or a heated exchange and you just don't have the resources you need to survive. Balancing how and when to use those items is vital knowledge you can attain from multiple playthroughs, or just reading a wiki. Cheating wee we used to have to buy the magazines in order to figure this stuff out. Now you might wonder how all of this equates to the design and interaction with enemies, but ultimately all of it has an impact. The functionality of the enemies often plays against the strengths of the environment, often hiding their weaknesses. Plus the overall encounter design is achieved by exploiting the player mechanics. When you consider the design of the enemy AI in the early Resident Evil games, they work largely to reinforce two things. They encourage the player to develop a stronger control of core mechanics, and to develop a better understanding of the layout of the game map. Ultimately, it holds up a mirror to your mastery of the player mechanics. Given the better you are at handling movement within the framework defined, the more capable you are at handling enemy threats. While the Resident Evil franchise has explored increasingly more grotesque and deformed organic monstrosities, the series is built around zombies, humans infected by one of the many weaponized viruses created by Umbrella and other unscrupulous organizations. While simple, they are the stepping stone from which every other enemy is built. But even the simplest of zombies is a viable threat. The actual AI implemented within them is really quite straightforward. In the event they see the player, or the game decides they know your location, they will simply move towards you and have some minor navigational knowledge, such that they can move around in more complex non-linear environments. The non-sticky collision means they can often slowly rub against surfaces, such as nearby walls or corners as they head towards you, but they have no real understanding of how to navigate obstacles. If they are then in range, they can attack the player and put you in a hold as they bite you, which you will then need to break out of. Fortunately, there's a short cooldown if they miss, or if you knock them off you after getting a bite in, they fall to the ground and give you a second to escape. What really works for the zombies is the lack of real estate and the player's juxtaposition. Getting a sense of just how far away the zombie is from the player or the angle you need to face to attack is the game's first real test of your abilities. The player's detachment from the character, combined with the fixed camera angle, makes it all the more difficult to ensure you've got space to act and your shots are going to connect. While the AI is quite dumb, the game's design makes them much more potent. When this is combined with the tight space in many of the corridors you move through, it makes close quarters combat fraught with peril, and navigating spaces without being hurt becomes all the more difficult. However, once the player finds themselves in more open spaces, zombies become increasingly harmless, given you need only take precaution to avoid attacks and then run around them during the cooldown before they try again. That said, the camera and controls can still lead to many a simple mistake in the heat of the moment, given you frequently have to get a grasp of the layout of the room and then know how you can move safely without taking damage. So much of the Resident Evil playbook in these early games is built on this concept. Combat is difficult and you need to take the time to familiarise yourself with the controls, the layout of each room, and how to stand your ground. The game often puts enemies in key areas, forcing you to either fight or take the extra time to lure them away from that point of interest. Plus, if you do leave some zombies behind, remembering where they are is crucial, and planning around it is vital, so you don't accidentally walk neck first into a zombie an hour or two later. One often overlooked element here is sound, given the zombies and all other enemy characters have unique idle and movement noises. Hence, even if you can't see them yet, you can often determine what enemies are in the room, and this will give you that extra bit of ammunition to figure out what to do next. All subsequent variations of enemies largely keep to the same formula, given they reinforce different aspects of the player mechanics. Cerberus, zombie dogs, are faster on their feet than the player, and while they will often run directly at you, after a successful or failed attack, they will frequently run to a safe spot before attacking again. Crows are the same concept, but using their height over the player to keep you on edge. In either case, you're forced to learn to time attacks more effectively. Meanwhile, the spiders are fast moving, can bite down on you, or can poison you with ranged attacks, forcing you to keep moving around the space. Meanwhile, the hunters, introduced in the latter half of the original game, culminate a lot of the lessons learned into something more lethal. They're quick on their feet, can navigate around the environment more effectively, have short attack cooldowns, and, critically, have the ability to insta-kill the player with a decapitation attack when you're at low health. Of course, alongside all of this are the bosses, but they don't add anything new to this dynamic, Ultimately, they present fixed spaces within which to fight off what are typically larger, more dangerous, and often kind of icky enemies. But the strategy is simple. Run around, turn, aim, shoot. I mean, yeah, this might still be difficult in practice, but they're not changing the mold in any real way. But even with this seemingly simple template, there's a lot of scope to manipulate the player and keep them on their toes. Enemy AI design challenges the player's mastery of control and context of the camera system, but the remaining key elements are often challenged by manipulating the player's expectations of what the game world presents. The real value add to the AI encounters is the memorization of the in-world topography. Navigating from one side of the Spencer mansion to the other in the original Resident Evil can be a bit of a hardship. You want to figure out not just the fastest route, but also, resources depending, the path of least resistance. But what if all that changes and forces the player into conflict in ways that pull them out of their comfort zone? Every entry of early Resident Evil plays with this formula to some extent, often changing a room to have more encounters based on progression. Though admittedly it gets a little harder when games like Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0 are trying to force the player into new locales. But still, it's interesting to see the variety of ways this is explored so early on in the franchise. The most obvious application of this is in the original game, where idle zombies found on the floor suddenly come to life and attack the player, or the infamous case of the Cerberus bursting through the window. The player is entering a room, assessing the state of it, and then responding to a change, typically that change being triggered by finding an item or completing a puzzle. This means that the gameplay space has been configured for this slightly more dynamic encounter, but this extends to a variety of bigger changes. The mansion becomes populated with even more enemies later in the first game, as the hunters begin to appear throughout. The player has largely memorized the space, but the introduction of a new enemy encounter forces you to re-evaluate it. These encounters are relatively cheap to implement versus building new gameplay spaces, and if executed right can add a lot of longevity to the game itself. An obvious example is that the original Resident Evil essentially has two playthroughs, with Jill and Chris having different encounters and storylines. Then adding atop that, the difficulty levels add more pressure to the combat. To really mix things up, Resident Evil Director's Cut, released in 1997, had game modes that changed the game even further, with a new set of enemy encounters and item locations moving around the map, all to add an extra challenge and force the player to not rely on established knowledge. All of these design practices are effectively condensed into the Resident Evil Remake, given it creates entirely new AI behaviours, adds new puzzles, and changes the house layout. It's arguably not as difficult a game as the Director's Cut, but it adds challenge in the same way the originals do. Fundamentally, the combat encounters don't change all that drastically, except for one key distinction: the Crimson Heads. In the remake, a dead zombie has the capacity to reanimate at a later point in time. It becomes faster, and its attacks do even more damage. This really ties all three of Resident Evil's core design pillars, combat, resource management, and map knowledge, into one element. First, you need to down the original zombie, and ideally, if you can hit its knees or blow its head off, it won't come back. But if you didn't, you still need to burn the body. To do that, you need fuel and a lighter. This is of course a resource problem, so you need to make sure you have those items at hand. And in the event you don't, you need to remember where the body is, go get that resource, and double back as fast as possible, given the time taken for a zombie to awaken as a Crimson Head is dependent on the difficulty. Sadly, despite games like Resident Evil Director's Cut setting a standard for crafting game modes that remix the item placement, the difficulty of the remake and Resident Evil 0 are built entirely around a scaled damage and hit point system, effectively just making the damage dealt and received increase, while the likes of Resident Evil 2 also reduced resource item placement. The survival horror chapter of Resident Evil burned through much of the franchise's creative real estate within a fairly short period of time. By the year 2000, with the release of Code Veronica, the franchise had largely perfected the format it aspired towards, but it didn't yield any further returns. Resident Evil 0 is something of a last hurrah, with the 2002 remake taking one final chance to apply those lessons learned. Ultimately, the design of these early games is predicated on an innate understanding of the mechanics and the challenges a player may face. In order to really push this further, the fidelity and agency of the player needed to evolve into something new. Thanks for watching this first video. In our Design Dive series on Resident Evil, it's given me a good excuse to not only revisit earlier games, but work my way through the more recent entries in the series. Stick around for part 2, where I'll be taking a look at the action trilogy of Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6, and how so many of the ideas introduced in this video stay true, while new encounter mechanics and difficulty tweaks help change it, both for better and worse.